Francis here joining me this evening. We see the human cost of gender-based violence every day, but having a calculation of the national economic cost is something activists say may be hard to do as government undertakes policy changes in a bid to end the suffering and injustice of this violence on a national level. We focus on 3 bills under review this evening. We'll tell you more about that in just a moment. First, your headlines.
Thanks, Sapiso. And also looking at the economy, we know a plan is on the table. We'll look at how that could be implemented, what could be discussed later when the president addresses the nation sometime this week. That leads the bulletin. Economic recovery, the subject of high-level discussions as lockdown level 1 beckons. The ANC to reimburse government for a trip to Zimbabwe on an SANDF plane. A teenager arrested in the Northern Cape after allegedly beheading a 17-year-old neighbour.
And our question of the day is this: the ANC says it will reimburse government for the SANDF flight to Zimbabwe. As you just heard from Francis, is this enough? What do you think? Tell us about it. What else should be done for compensation? Please use hashtag FullView to respond. And of course, you can send us your voice notes or video call us +27 66 479 8056. Remember, you can view any of our interviews or features on SABCnews.com. You'll also find us on Facebook and Twitter. President Cyril Ramaphosa released a statement last week saying 3 key bills relating to gender-based violence had been introduced in Parliament tonight. We examine these to find out if they'll provide some respite to victims and survivors of femicide and violence against women and children. Last year, Ramaphosa committed to dedicating resources towards the cause following a protest march to Parliament by women's organizations. At that time, the nation was reeling from the murders of Uyinene Mkhwetyana, Leandra Yichels and Jesse Hess, and a number of others. And now many more incidents of gender violence continue to dominate headlines. Joining us now is the Deputy Minister of Justice, John Jeffery, and Brenda Madumise-Pajibo, who's the Director of Wise for Africa, to unpack these. A very good evening to you both, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Before I ask this question about whether or not these proposed amendments are appropriate responses to GBV, perhaps let's start with you, Deputy Minister. If you could just one by one, and without explaining too much what the amendments are, because we'll follow into that, what they are, what amendments are we looking at to what laws?
Okay, 3 bills. First one, Domestic Violence Amendment Bill, tightening up the Domestic Violence Act. The other 2 then are more closely related. There's the Sexual Offences, Criminal Law Sexual Offences Amendment Bill, which is an amendment largely to the Sexual Offences Act. It deals with the National Register for Sex Offenders, does slightly increase the types of crimes that are referred to there. And then the last one is the Criminal and Related Matters Amendment Bill, which deals with issues of bail, a number of issues, bail, use of intermediaries in court, extending that, and then also tightening up sentencing.
Okay.
So that's roughly in a nutshell the 3 bills.
All right. Then let me hear from you, Ms. Pajibo. Do you think that these are appropriate response to the scourge of violence that we face in the country, the numbers which have increased at an alarming rate during lockdown, and the the depravity of it, in fact, has been alarming, even making international headlines?
They're a step in the right direction to assist us in dealing with impunity and just brazenness of those who commit these acts of violence, thinking that they can get away with such acts. So it's important for us to tighten these laws, but importantly is those who are given the responsibility to apply and implement these laws understand exactly what they're about to implement. Because once you give the courts, you give the police certain responsibilities and obligations, we expect that kind of vigilance from them to apply the law in its entirety and with vigilance. And for us, these bills the three of them are important. If you look at the ones dealing with bail, there's been a reluctance on many magistrates and even prosecutors themselves to oppose bail in matters of domestic violence and sexual offences cases.
So I'm going to ask that we look at them one by one, because I just don't want us to confuse our viewers. So I'm just going to start with the first one that we're talking about, the Criminal Law Offences and Related Amendment Act. Deputy Minister, I want to find out from you, incest. Why has that never been categorized as a crime?
No, it has been. I think the provision is more technical. I think that's actually in the Sexual Offences Bill, not in the Criminal and Related Matters. But I think it's. I'm just trying to find the exact section, but it's basically to deal with a situation where people in the same family are having a sexual relationship and the child may consent to it. That is that's no excuse. It's a crime.
And talk to us about what is groundbreaking about the Sexual Offences Proposed Amendment Act. And I'm talking here about the failure to report suspected or actual abuse of children, disabled people, or the elderly.
Yeah, look, that again, I think is that not more in the criminal and related matters? Maybe we're all getting confused.
Okay, this is the thing, because the way they're all written, it seems to the one seems to strengthen the other and refer to the other. So let's leave the categorization to here.
Yes, all three bills link together. So that's why they're the three gender-based violence bills. Domestic violence stands more on its own, but there are also interlinkages, particularly with criminal and related. But on the issue of what's new with the Sexual Offences Bill, I mean, apart from the issue of incest, the main issue is changing the way the National Register of Sex Offenders works. Now, that hasn't been a great success. It was something that the portfolio or the Parliament put into the Sexual Offences Act when it first came out. It only applied to people who had committed a sexual offence against a child. That's a person under the age of 18 or a mentally disabled person. And it only needed to be checked by people who are going to employ people to look after or work with children or mentally disabled people. Now it's been expanded. Basically, any sexual offence, if you're found guilty of any sexual offence, your name goes onto the register. And then secondly, it's a wider category of persons. I think it's called a vulnerable. If you're working with vulnerable people, that would include women up until the age of 25. It would include other groups of people who are vulnerable as well. The register has to be checked that you don't have any sexual offence that you have committed if you're going to work with those people.
And Ms. Pajibo,
so that in a nutshell, that bill.
Is this enough to end the dissatisfaction that gender-based violence survivors have with the criminal justice system? Some of these amendments, including the fact that, as the Minister mentioned, that there has been improvement on the listing of the National Registries Act. Sex Offenders Bill.
So the sexual offence registry, for the longest of time, it was not public. And also it had limited, the categories were limited, as the deputy minister said, it involved children and people with disability or mentally challenged. So what this bill, the amendment, is proposing to do is to broaden the scope. We're including any sexual offence in that, and we're going to push for it to be public. We tend to know the victims of violence, but you don't get to know the perpetrators most of the time. And this is the opportunity for us to know the perpetrators and be able to have them on the register. And all of them need to be able to meet certain criteria and requirements for them to be removed from that register. So we will all know in a particular area that this individual is a sex offender, and we need to be vigilant once we know that that individual is in the community and we know how to deal with them once they're in the community.
You mentioned the police earlier on. They're now going to be held more accountable. In fact, they'll be liable for dismissal. But I want to talk about what you talk about, the lack of transparency. The police in collating data, for instance, companies are not compelled to reveal who the sexual offenders are, whether there are hearings which find them guilty or not. Even at educational institutions, there's no obligation to report these disciplinary proceedings. Should the law not have been looking at some of these issues?
Are you talking to me?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am referring to you, because you spoke about the police earlier on and the accountability that they face.
I think in our approach as South Africans, then all of us have got an obligation to ending gender-based violence, right? Every single time effort should and be done by all of us to ensure that we rid our society of violence against women and young girls. So if you are in an university and you have lecturers who are perpetrators of violence against students, against fellow colleagues as lecturers, that information should be made available, because one, if it's a criminal offense, it has to be reported to the police, and that lecturer or an individual in the university will find themselves in that register. So it's really the responsibility of all of us to ensure that once we have these kinds of laws, and we have had laws before, is that we continue to ensure the implementation to the letter, and not have situations where we want to shortchange ourselves and try and bribe the police, try to bribe the prosecutors for a matter not to proceed. It is our responsibility, all of us, to ensure that justice prevails once there is a crime committed against the state, meaning any crime involving, if there is a domestic matter or it's a sexual harassment matter, it's a sexual offense matter, those must be dealt with and dealt with thoroughly.
Deputy Minister, I hear that you wanted to jump in on that. I want you to talk to that, including the fact that some of the complaints by activists is that the underreporting also comes in where the context in which the sexual offences are committed is not recorded, including the extent of the violence.
Sure, but just let me raise a couple of points, just in case I don't get a chance to raise them later. The bills are now with Parliament, with the National Assembly. They're out for public comment. They're out for public comment until the 9th of October. I would really encourage everybody who's concerned about the issue to get copies of the bill. They're on Parliament's website, they're on the Department of Justice's website, and then make submissions to Parliament on the bills. Secondly, the bills are not about, there's no magic bullet. We can't press a switch and that's the end of gender-based violence. It's a societal issue. Women are being attacked not by some outsiders or whatever, but by men, and men in our society. And that obviously makes it more difficult for the state to do anything about it. Just to say then, in response to your question, the laws are also then implemented by people, by police people, by court officials, by magistrates. They can make mistakes or they can have their own prejudices. When something goes wrong, when you get turned away by a court, when you've gone to court to try and get a protection order, please report that you were turned away. What time was it? Who was it? What did they look like if they didn't give you the name? If there was a problem with a magistrate not granting a protection order when they should have, please also report that so that we can take that up. So we'll only get the law implemented correctly if there are consequences when people don't do what they're meant to do.
Ms. Pajibo, just in terms of these amendments, will they, for instance, prevent perpetrators from evading the law? If we look at the Domestic Act, the Domestic Offences Act, the definitions have been broadened. Will this prevent people from getting away with some of these violent acts and being able to apply for a protection order online? Does that make things more practical and easier?
That's what we hope.
It does to a certain extent. And I'll give an example. During the lockdown and subsequent to us moving to lockdown level 3, is that because the courts were regulating the number of individuals who must enter the courts, you had many women who had wanted to apply for protection orders in magistrate courts but could not go in because the numbers were curtailed. So you had women having to come into the courts but being turned away because they've reached the number for the day. And you have to go back home to deal with the very same perpetrator that you wanted to report and protect yourself against. Now, if we had an online facility, most women would have utilized that online facility. It's not the answer to all the women, but it goes a long way for those women who have the facility to access the internet and have got smartphones to be able to download the info and apply for protection online. It's a step in the direction, and it must be encouraged, but also make sure that when I walk into a court, I can still apply for a protection order and get one.
Deputy Minister, government has set aside, I think, 1.6 billion rand of government resources to tackle this issue. The costs in 2014, I think, were saying to the country, the economy stands at 48 billion rand in terms of gender-based violence and femicide. So it goes without question that this is not enough. But what about the unforeseen costs? How do you intend to tackle this? Are you looking at adding more money into the kitty to deal with this?
What are you meaning by unforeseen costs?
Mental health issues, the fact that children...
Okay. Yeah, there is provision in, I think it's the domestic violence bill, to try and set out greater certainty as to what victims, survivors can expect. There's also already provision for support services in the Sexual Offences Act. But yes, we'd like obviously to have more money. The problem is, given the economic problems, there's less money available. So that's something, basically we've got to make use of what we've got and make maximum use of what we've got effectively.
All right, thank you so much. And I do apologize we had so little time to discuss such three intricate bills, amendment bills that we're talking about. But thank you very much to yourselves, Deputy Minister of Justice John Jeffery, and Brenda Madumise-Pajibo is the Director for Wise for Africa. So what do you think? Will these bills make a dent? Will it allow for women, children and the elderly to walk down the streets and sleep more peacefully? You share your thoughts. We're going to take a quick